In this session, the panelists are going to discuss housing as a vital part of our liberation struggles and demands for health justice. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First of all, we have, to my right, we have Kwajo. He's a campaigner from South London who uses social media to give a voice to a variety of social issues. After publicly shaming his housing association into carrying out repairs on his family's flat after a year of inaction, Kwajo has traveled the country, putting pressure on politicians and social housing providers to improve living standards. He passionately campaigns for change, having met with government officials from all sides of the spectrum. So thank you for having us, Kwajo. Did I say thank you for having us? I'm confused where I'm confused where I am. Thank you for coming. Next to Kwajo's right, we have Nanu. She's an organizer and volunteer at Migrants Organize. She facilitates the women's group and organizes for housing justice and the end of the hostile environment. Thank you for coming. To her right, we have Dr. Shabna Begum. She's currently interim co-CEO of the Runnymede Trust and author of From Sylhet to Spitalfields, Bengali Squatters in 1970s East London. She was a teacher for over 20 years and has always centered racial justice in her work. Thank you for coming. And finally, to her right, we have Joshua. He's an anti-racist activist and organizer. He's the author of How to Change It, Make a Difference, a handbook for young activists published with Stormzy and Penguin's Murky Books. He's also written for The Guardian, The Independent, and Novara Media, and contributed a chapter on anti-racism to futures and socialism. Thank you for coming. So I think without further ado, we'd like to just jump right in, and I'd like to invite the speakers to maybe tell us all a little bit about your work. And if that's okay, we start with you, Shabna. We know you worked a lot around the UK housing context, and I think there's maybe something about the history of that you'd like to also share with us. So I'll go ahead and give you the floor.
All right. So I guess the invitation to me to attend this session, first of all, I feel very, very special and blessed to have even been invited to be part of this conversation. I think that we are obviously all sitting here at a time where global events, what's happening in Gaza, ideas about home and homeland, we can see the devastation that can wreak on populations. And I think it's really important that I note that, and I know that that sits in everyone's hearts as we sit here today in the safety of our homes, I hope, knowing that safety isn't offered to the people of Gaza. And I think it's really important to start with that. The other thing to say is that you said I was a doctor. I only became a doctor very recently. So academia was never my journey. It was never my ambition. It became a thing that I did because I was speaking to my parents. I spoke to my parents and they told me all about their migration history. So they arrived, my dad arrived here in the 1960s. My mum came later on in the 1970s. And they would always tell me in that way that parents do about how hard life was for them and how grateful I should be. And when I was a kid, I didn't hear it. I couldn't hear it because it was like, whatever. But it was only when I became a mum myself and had children myself that I began to kind of think about how hard it must have been for them to have been migrants and to endure some of the housing issues and struggles that they confronted. So in the 1970s, my parents told me about the fact that they squatted. So I was born in a squat in just off Brick Lane. And that was because the Bengali community at the time in Tower Hamlets were deprived of housing. They were deprived of housing because of institutional racism. And as I walked around the exhibition today, there's so much of the DWP and the work and the violence that they commit against our communities that is so resonant to the violence that was being committed in the 1970s through housing. And what we had was institutional racism, the state, Tower Hamlets Council, GLC, conspiring to create a system whereby you were disqualified for housing despite the fact that you might have been there, a resident for 5 years or whatever. So my dad had been there for like 10 odd years. My mum arrived in the 1970s. I was born. They didn't have anywhere to live. The men folk had previously lived in this kind of shared accommodation, like 10, 12 people to a flat, but that wasn't kind of suitable for when you had a young family. So my parents ended up squatting, not deliberately, but they ended up squatting in a house just off Brick Lane. And whilst they didn't do it actively as a political movement, they were kind of accidental squatters, what happened around them was a Bengali community who faced that institutional racism, who decided that actually if the state wasn't going to give them the housing, that they were going to have to take it, because actually survival meant you didn't have any other choice. So sometimes we think about politics in this kind of ideological, principled way. This was survival. And so you had you had hundreds of Bengali people who were in a very similar position, who squatted, and they connected up to Race Today. Now, I don't know how many of you know of Race Today, but the Race Today Collective were a group of intellectuals, academics, and activists. They were writers. They believed that you got change not just through definitely not through policy influencing, but through community organizing, through changing the narrative, through speaking through cultural institutions and shaping stories. And they came in and supported the Bengali housing activists with the campaign that they built around the fact that actually they were entitled to this housing. They were were residents, they paid their taxes, and they qualified for the housing. The other thing to note as well was the violence that was committed against them by the National Front. Again, we had the kind of state violence twinning with the street violence, where you had the National Front who would rampage down Brick Lane, who would attack people quite randomly, whether it's broad daylight, whether you're a woman, whether you're a child, or whether you're an old man. And so you had those twin systems of violence which were really active in trying to push that narrative, which we see again all around us, about who deserves to belong, who deserves to have a home. And the state and the National Front and the kind of racist violence that those communities faced was very much an expression and an articulation of the fact that this group didn't belong. And I don't want to romanticize it, and I know, Tarek, you want to keep me to time, so I'm not going to say kind of too much more. I don't want to romanticize it and pretend like it was all kind of huggy and hand-holdy and everyone succeeded and it was all great. It wasn't. The Race Today Collective were really disappointed when the Bengali squatters actually won an amnesty. They won an amnesty and they secured the council housing, because actually that was a movement ended, but it didn't address the fundamental kind of system, and it didn't address the systemic changes that needed to be made. And in fact, if anything, in some ways, lots of people got co-opted into a system that actually made some modest changes to accommodate it, but not really to kind of change the fundamentals of how the system operated. And just finally, so much of that none of that lives in the 1970s. So my work is very much about the 1970s and that particular kind of movement and the people that were involved, collecting oral histories of the people that were involved, because the other part of it is that my parents told me about it, but no one else had thought to write anything about it or to record it or to keep any kind of the accounts of the people that were involved. And again, that's the other level of violence that's committed, is the erasure of our histories. We're robbed of our memory of those struggles, and therefore deprived the courage that we can and nourishment that we take from those experiences as well. But just finally, so Tarek, you mentioned that I work at the Runnymede Trust right now. So the Runnymede Trust, we think about racial equality and racial justice, and we know that housing and home is still a fundamental issue, and it's a racialized issue, and people experience it in so many kind of ways that are invisibilized, and also that same action of it's your fault. You somehow have kind of, you don't deserve the housing, and actually you don't deserve the kind of life where you might be able to live in a home that is one that where you can thrive and actually enjoy a life and flourish. So the 1970s is where I start the conversation, but actually my work today is very much about how that still lives on in the policies and the programs that the government continues to plow out.
Thank you so much for, I think, such a powerful account, especially your own account, your family history in this. I mean, I think some things I'm going to hold on to. I think it's just the centrality of institutional racism. I think racism is often, as we know, reduced to, overt violence. And you mentioned National Front, and that sort of takes primacy over that sort of institutional racism, where the very idea of marginalizing people through housing and how powerful it is that people have no safe space, no place of security, and just the impact that has on families. So I think that's something to hold on to as we open it up for later. I'd like to maybe go already to our next speaker, Kwajo. You're an avid campaigner. I think I myself follow your work on Twitter and social media, and you've been really powerful in highlighting the abysmal conditions that many people are really forced to live in. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about that work as well.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Kwajo Tweneboa, and I'm a housing campaigner. I have been for the last around 3 years. I can't remember exactly when I started now. But it's been a very, very busy 3 years. And I didn't wake up one day and decide I wanted to be a housing campaigner or a social housing activist. It was almost a title that was given to me. I've grown up in social housing from when I was young, and it was poor social housing, poor quality social housing. And my dad for years fought just to get a social housing property for me and my siblings. And during that sort of fight, we moved from a temporary accommodation, which happened to be a converted car garage that wasn't too far from here. It was just West Norwood, with a garage door still on it. It was poorly converted. There was damp, there was mold, and I was having to share a bed with my sisters whilst I was studying for my A-levels. I was in my final year, and my sister was in her GCSEs. And we were forced to live in there, and there was a huge sense of shame. We would never want to bring anyone around, because you'd have to then justify why it is that you're living in a garage. And I believe the automatic assumption would be it's down to your family. Either your family's poor, or they found themselves or put themselves in those situations. And it definitely wasn't something that was considered normal. Why? Because we weren't having these conversations. And it moved from that to us then moving into our permanent social housing that my dad fought for years to get. And it was poor conditions. I mean, we were moved into disrepair. We had issues like cockroaches, mice, damp, mold. We had a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old. We had lights that were filled with rainwater whenever it rained. We had a bathroom that wasn't fit for use. We had a home that was described as a workman towards the very, very end as not fit for animals to even be living in. And me and my family were forced to live in there while studying for our, whether it be A-levels or GCSEs or whatever, university, and we were expected to go on like it was normal. And my dad became ill. He was diagnosed with stage 1 esophageal cancer, which is a tumour in the throat, and it's a very aggressive form of cancer. And up until that point, we hadn't experienced anyone becoming ill, luckily, or passing away, luckily. At the age that we were, and we very much thought it was stage 1. You assume, had you not been around anyone else with cancer, that if it's caught at stage 1, that's a good stage to find it, because you will survive. And it was very much, I was in that naive belief that was the case. But in the space of a year, it's progressed from stage 1 to stage 4, and he went from walking around and eating and swallowing his own saliva to no longer being able to eat, no longer being able to drink or swallow his own saliva, or even walk for that matter. And he was the size of my younger sister, and he was even smaller than that. She was 8 stone at the time. And he became ill, and in January 2020 passed away amongst those conditions. And he had been fed through his stomach by district nurses 3 times a day in those conditions, and they were horrified. And that went on for the duration of the year. And things just went from bad to worse. We had our ceiling cave in on the day of his funeral, and that was February 2020. No one came out until October that same year to pull it down. And then when they pulled it down, they didn't tell us it contained asbestos. And me and my sisters were living in there. And then we found out ceiling wasn't going back up until January of the following year. So we went throughout Christmas with beams, and you could see daylight through our brickwork, and the house was completely freezing. And it went on until later in that year when I was chasing them for all the other sort of issues with disrepair that no one should be living with. Cockroaches, mice, lights that were filled with water, a kitchen and bathroom that wasn't fit for use. And I had phoned them one day whilst I was working at secondary school in Mitcham across the road from where we were living, and they hung the phone up on me and was very dismissive and said no one can come out. And at that point, I decided that was enough. Like, I was so drained. I went through my dad passing away. I was at the time, I can admit now, and I'm very comfortable admitting it, I was suicidal, and I didn't expect to be here today. And I was pushed to as far as you can be pushed. There wasn't much further I could go. And I decided at that point, there's only one thing I can do, and that is take pictures of my home and upload it to social media, regardless of the response that I get, regardless of the sort of blame that we receive. And that's exactly what I did, and it was the best thing that I've ever done. And I was expecting so much hate, but I got the complete opposite. And ITV News even picked it up. And they were, at the time, 2 months before, coincidentally started reporting on the poor state of social housing here in the UK. And the national team came down and done an undercover investigation for 2 weeks on my estate. And I helped them. We went and knocked on every single door on my estate, over 500 homes. And there were people in there living in absolute slum conditions. There was one woman, for example, 27 years, she had complained about the conditions she was having to live in, from Ghana. She knew my dad very well. She worked in my school. She was my colleague, and she was a cleaner. And she had 3 cleaning jobs. She got up at 3 a.m. and didn't finish work until about 7 or 8 p.m. that night. And she'd done that for years, and she was having to buy cement in B&Q and mix it in her kitchen to fill holes where mice were coming through, even though she had complained to her landlord about it, and it was within their contract to fix it. It was their obligation, but they didn't. And I had kids that I was teaching on that estate where ceilings would cave in during lockdown, and they were doing online learning, and my colleagues were teaching them. And I decided at that point I can't pull the ladder up behind me. It would be very easy for me to disgrace my landlord on television and get my home fixed. That was the easy sort of challenge for me, but it wasn't good enough because I knew there was people on my estate, and I'm not stupid, not just on my estate, across the country, that would have been living in the same conditions. My landlord happened to be the biggest social housing provider in Europe at that time. And so I continued. I didn't stop. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know whether I'd be able to continue. I left my job. I at the time was highlighting individual cases, going into people's homes and disgracing landlords online. I'd be on the way up to Leicester for university 3 times a week on the coach, sending emails to MPs on behalf of residents. I'd be in my lectures doing exactly the same. And I in my heart of heart, I didn't think I was going to even finish university. The reason I did was because before my dad passed away, I had one wish, and that was for him to be there on the day of my graduation. And unfortunately, he wouldn't. And I knew I had to finish university for him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered, I'd be honest. But I continued, and I learned that the issues were only getting bigger and bigger, and my job wasn't getting easier. My inbox was just getting more and more full, whether that be on Twitter, emails, you name it. It was just non-stop, and it was people desperate for help. So I continued uploading it to social media. I would continue getting responses from landlords and providers, and them doing what they should have been doing all along. And I realised this is something that works. Then the government picked it up. Michael Gove, who's now in charge of the Department for Levelling Up and Housing, he's a Secretary of State, picked it up, invited me in. And so far I've met the likes of Sadiq Khan, Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer, Michael Gove, and helped influence the social housing regulation bill that's come out this year. But by no means does that mean the issue is fixed. Only yesterday, it was in The Guardian. I don't know if anyone saw it, but there was a man that was living with noise. He had made noise complaints over 20 times to his housing provider that happens to be the same landlord as me, 3 years on from my case. And he suffered with mental health. But it was announced by the Housing Ombudsman, who I've also met, that he took his own life 9 months into making those complaints. And he was accused of whining by our landlord. Again, that happens to me, my landlord. And this was 3 years on from my case. So I knew the culture really hadn't changed and that people fundamentally were dying in their homes and dying in social housing. And this is 6.5 years, nearly 7 years on from Grenfell. And we all know what that was like. I remember waking up and seeing that, as I'm sure everyone else does in the room. Yet people are still having to live in these conditions. And that's why I continue. I'm not paid for it. I'm not affiliated to any political party. I'm not paid by anyone. I don't work for any housing organisation, any local authority. I do it because I care. And I do it because the people that are supposed to care right now don't. And that is why ultimately I'm here. That's why I go around doing these talks, is not only to educate people that this is happening, but people are dying in their homes. Fundamentally, in 2023 Britain, nearly 2024 Britain, this is what's happening to people. Only last year was announced the death of Al Ishaq, the young 2-year-old boy that lived in a house filled with damp and mold. 6.5 years ago, 72 people lost their lives in Grenfell. Yet we are still facing this issue within housing, and not just social housing, private rented accommodation too. The rental sector and housing in general is completely on its knees in this country, yet it affects every single individual in this room, and not even just in this room, across the country. Yet unfortunately, politicians don't realise that, and they don't treat it as important as it should be. For the last 30 years, social housing, 40 years, has been neglected and sold off even. Yet we have 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. We've currently got 131,000 homeless kids in England alone. A no-fault eviction in the private rental sector, evicting a family, is handed out every 8 minutes to a family, rendering them homeless. Yet we've already got a backlog of 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. And it was announced, I think, today, that private rental prices have on average gone up, I think it was, I'm sure I saw it on Sky News before I came here, by 77%. And at what point do we draw the line? At what point do we speak out and say enough is enough? And that is what I wanted to start through my work, not only through my story, but the stories of others that I've met, people terminally ill in their homes that aren't asking for anything but to dying dignity. That is it. And to look after their kids that are left behind. That's all. Stage 4 cancer living in homes lung cancer filled with damp and mold, or breast cancer with a child living in complete disrepair and they don't know what's going to happen to them once they pass away. These aren't people that are asking for a red carpet to be rolled out for them. They're not asking to live in Buckingham Palace. They're asking to be treated with dignity, and that's it. And that's why I continue to do what I do, because I care and not enough people, especially within power, do. So that's what I do.
Thank you so much, Kwajo. I think we can all agree that was a very touching account. I just want to, first of all, thank you for the courage and bravery to speak out on that. I think you shared a lot of also personal experiences that can be very difficult for us all to hold on to, but I think we really appreciate you bringing that into the space. I mean, 2 things that really also touched me from your story is the idea that so many people are living unseen for so long. And just how powerful that moment is when you start going around. You see someone living for over 20 years in terrible conditions. And then someone finally bore witness to that, to what they were going through, I think was very powerful. And I think just the element of validating that. And I think something else that really touched me is how your father fought for the dignity of your family. And I would say it seems to be no coincidence when you're at a juncture where you could have just done something for yourself. But it seems like the spirit of your father in that sense has led you to think about others as well and fighting for your community. So we really appreciate your work. Nanu? Yes. We'd like to hear about your work as well. So maybe you can speak towards your organization and on housing struggles. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It's very much appreciated that people can come under the rain to come here and support. This is what I believe, the hope I always have is that when people come together like this, we can make things happen. My name is Nano. I am an organizer and what can I say, a member of an organization called Migrant Organize. Migrant Organize is an organization that organizing to fight to end the hostile environment. My job at Migrant Organizer started as a I was facilitating a group of women. These women are refugees and asylum seekers. Sometimes when I get to talk about story, people don't know exactly, like my colleague just explained, what's going on in this world. We see things that is unseen. So I was facilitating this group during the lockdown. I seen a lot of things, but I never thought in England or in London people can live in this sort of life. When we're talking about asylum seekers, so when you seek for protection in this country, Home Office is supposed to give you an accommodation to live. They give people hotel room or a home where you can share with other people. This place is supposed to be safe, secure, and warm, but the reality is a place that human beings could live. When you hear name hotel, you think it's 5-star hotel room. It's not 5-star hotel room. We call it open door prison. People live in the situation that we saw children doing their homework on top of a bed or eating their dinner on bed. Women were sharing room with other women during the lockdown while they asked people to care for each other. It was a thing that we couldn't accept anymore. So in Migrant Organize, as member of Migrant Organize, people were living the experience of that kind of life. We decided and then we say enough is enough. What kind of a legacy are we living in this country? Because this situation didn't start today. So we say we have to stand up, raise our voice, raise an awareness, tell people what's actually going on. When company like ClearSpring, so ClearSpring is a company that signed contract with the Home Office to provide safe, secure, and warm home to refugees and asylum seekers. But the reality is they don't provide home. They provide mental health. They provide anxiety. They push people to end their life while they're profiting beyond our misery. So we came together as a group. We decided that enough is enough. We have to speak up. So what we do as a group, we organize and we tell people the reality of life that we as refugees and asylum seekers are living in those hotels. At the beginning of this year, we published our exhibition in the housing. The material that we provided was stuff that we made ourselves. People living in a hotel, they made video, they made pictures, and we gave some kind of testimony. People was listening to us. We have to tell the community kind of life that we live in our community. So we start organizing. I think our first exhibition made an impact because people came and they saw the reality of what people going through. Myself personally, I think what make me raise my voice when I speak in public is because I'm always thinking that if we don't speak up, if we don't raise our voice, we're still going to continue to live the same kind of life while people are profiting behind our back. According to our research, last year, ClearSpring, the organization that signed in contract with the Home Office, the reporting of the year was 28 million of pounds behind our back. This year, when we check, you guess how much they made? 64 million. So the question is, what can we do as a community? In our group, we say that each one bring one. This is how we can build our movement. This is how we can hand things. When we speak up, when we ask for what we want, I think we can find solution. So we've been doing research, we've been organizing. Our target is ClearSpring, the company that I just said the name. They don't provide what they're supposed to provide to people. And we send them our letter of demand. We ask them what we wanted. All we ask them is to treat people with dignity, justice, freedom. They say that they do provide that. But we live in those places we know they don't provide that. And we cannot sit back and continue to live in this kind of life that we live. Nobody deserves to live that kind of life. So we believe that as a community, as organization, as human being, we can hand this ourselves by speaking, by raising our voice, by raising an awareness, because we are human beings. There's something I wanted to say. This is from our group where we organize. Yesterday was our meeting. Some of our members, they came up with something. They said they live in a room that is a single room for one person. Yesterday they were bringing new people to share a single room for 2 people. There's no space in a room. People cannot breathe. When we're talking only about the room, I haven't mentioned food, kind of food that they give to people. This is not accommodation. We can't call it accommodation. These are detention and open-door prison. I just want to say exactly how our people and our members feel about this. My microphone, this one is not working. Sorry. So whether this accommodation is disposal accommodation, often housing or accommodation provided by the Home Office or within the detention hotel, the reality is that people are challenging conditions with no control over their life. ClearSpring use the power given to them by Home Office to disrupt people's life and put them into danger. I'm sorry, I just want to read this so it doesn't come from me personally. It's people that are living the experience of those kind of places. ClearSpring accommodation is just one example of how the hostile environment is dangerous for our member, health and safety. When member, as we call ourselves, or community, are member of one of organization, we create a community where we have friends, kind of family, but one day you might wake up just in the morning and you receive a message that there's a taxi coming to pick you. And when the taxi comes, you pack your stuff within less than 1 minute. When the taxi picks you, the destination is unknown. So we believe that people cannot live this kind of life because we are human. When we seek protection, it doesn't mean we seek punishment. That's how we feel. So we think this must change. But there's nobody can change it apart from ourselves. Coming together as a community, raise our voice, and ask for freedom, dignity, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for, I think, giving us that reminder. I think that very powerful reminder that so many people are stripped of their dignity. And I think that's always something that we must always consider, I think, at all times, especially for asylum seekers, who we know are some of the most marginalized around the world. But I think you make such a powerful connection to here in the UK of how that's embedded within a racist framework, especially. Raising the point of the hostile environment. We know, I think the thing that I'm always reminded of when Nigel Farage was mobilizing for Brexit, and he stood in front of a poster of people apparently who are invading Britain, right? This idea of Fortress Britain, we have to protect our borders. And of course, the people on the poster aren't Scandinavians, you know? The people on the poster are these racialized minorities who are deemed as undeserving of the dignity that Britain provides. And I think it speaks very strongly to the work that you do to provide that dignity to these individuals. Oh, there's also a really important point you mentioned about privatization, and I would love to return to that subject as well, but I would like to have finally our fourth speaker, Josh, to share your thoughts, your experiences. I think you, I think you were going to speak to us about the health crisis with housing. Just take it away. Thank you.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Thank you, Tariq, and thank you for the contribution so far, and thank you to HJL for creating this space and for creating this conversation, and I feel very honored to follow these three powerful contributions. I'm going to use some notes at times because I'm sleep deprived. I almost forgot what I was. I'm sleep deprived, and I've got a cold, so bear with me a bit. I will maybe speak a bit about how health justice relates to housing justice and how climate justice relates to housing justice. But I actually wanted to kind of jump off of the provocation of the session. If I got it right, I think it's called Housing Struggles, Making Hope and Home. And I guess I also just want to echo Shabna and say, like, it only feels right to acknowledge that in this moment, making hope and making home feels like a difficult subject to broach when you're watching things like the Jabalia massacre and you're watching homes be destroyed and pummeled and flattened, and hope feels like a very difficult thing to think about. But that's why we come together, and that's why we struggle, and that's why we fight, and we believe that something else is different. So on making hope and home, I guess first I'll start with the union, the organization I'm part of, which didn't make it to the bio. All the other stuff is cool, book, that's nice. But I'm actually, my day job is that I'm a staffer at a union called the London Renters Union. It's a tenants union, and it's a little clap at the back. Thank you. So this union is it started in about like 2017, so that's 6 years ago. And we were set up because it was in the recognition that, as Kwajo said, like the private rented sector is abominable. It's a place of devastation. It's a disabling place. It's a place of private of profiteering and misery, as you said, like as you said, Nanu. As you said, like profiting of misery is what happens there. So we wanted to set up a union for tenants in the private renter sector. As fate has it, we have a lot of members that are also in social housing, and we struggle in social housing, and we're fighting in estates in Hackney and in Catford, and in other parts of London, in Newham and Brent. We have 6 branches, and we now have over 7,000 members, which is amazing. And I guess like we believe that the housing system is rigged in the interest of landlords, and it's not working in the interest of regular people, of ordinary people. And that is so self-evident in the fact that, people are profiting from misery, as you said, Nanu. And like that, a crisis is always a fortune. There's a fortune to be made in a crisis, right? In these organizations like ClearSpring are using the migrant crisis to profiteer, right? The housing crisis is actually a crisis of profiteering, of not far from where I live, there was 2 flats that were sold for £100 million. Like, what on earth? How do you value something like that? It's because it's an opportunity to profiteer, right? These homes in these parts of London are actually parts of big capital flows between war money. When the Libyan war started, lots of high-end estate agents were talking about how much money was to be made in like housing, because people were moving their money out. Like war. The relationship between war and housing in London is very interesting. And anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but we believe that it's not working in the favor of ordinary people. So I'm going to just like quickly kind of speak to the making hope and making home bit. So making hope, for me, is found, and I guess I just want to say, like, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of like the union. I am in the union, but like what I say is not like union positions. It's based off of like being in the union, but especially because it's recorded and stuff. So hope for me is found in each other, in solidarity, and in taking action. And I wanted to qualify those a bit and also use it as an opportunity to talk about what we do in the union. So in each other, for me, means like when we recognize and rehumanize one another. Like so much of living in, these stories that were so generously shared with us, dehumanize us. And as you said, like, you put your story out and you expect to be further dehumanized because there's so much ideological work at play that makes us believe that people aren't deserving or that people are at fault. So when we come together in the union, we are trying to like recognize each other's agency and ability and rehumanize one another. And we have 4 kind of key pillars in the union, and I'll speak to them. So 2 of them are community and empowerment. So community is about building spaces in our communities, like building spaces of coordination, of collectivizing our agency, like the kind of things that Shabna spoke about in the past, where community comes together, of listening, of building teams. We have branches. In the branches, they have teams, we have elections, we have roles. People come because they have housing issues, and they stay because they win, and they fight, and they want to empower other people to fight. And we have loads of leaders in our branches across the city. So building community is a big part of it. Empowerment, which is like a big part of my role within the union, is about building spaces of learning. So when I say in each other, I find hope in each other, because when we create spaces of learning, we're training one another. Like a lot of our trainings are by staff, but also by members who have come to trainings, have learned how to do negotiations with housing associations, have learned how to take action against billionaire landlords. And through this learning and experience, they want to train each other, and we become teams, right? And so this kind of community and empowerment is when I say in each other. In solidarity and in taking action is when we struggle with one another. So the other 2 pillars of the union are member solidarity and campaigning. And member solidarity takes lots of forms. Like I said, sometimes we're fighting against billionaire landlords, sometimes we're fighting against Clarion, sometimes we're fighting against a letting agent. And And member solidarity is about like, it's kind of like the bread and butter of what we do. People come with issues to the union. Sometimes people come to meetings with lots of issues and there's like 20, 30 people, and we do collective casework with each other. So we get into groups. There's some staff, there's people who are experienced with fighting their own disputes, and we come together and we build disputes with one another, and we fight these disputes with one another, and we win these disputes regularly. And when we win, we celebrate, and we carry on and we build. So that's member solidarity. And the campaigning bit is like the bigger piece, right? Like, where do we take that power that we build through our disputes? When we build our branches and we build our membership, we need to use that, lots of our members love to talk about the kind of Nelson Mandela, like the people coming together and the 5 fingers making the fist, and then, you got to knock somebody out. And the campaigning is trying to knock somebody out. And our campaigning is, as Kwajo mentioned, like, rents are soaring. And somebody's making a lot of money. And we've done actions outside Foxton's. Foxton's is Foxton's like a letting agent. And they were putting emails out in the middle of when, there was a real, like, rent crisis. We still have one, but at the peak of it, they were sending emails out to their clients saying, now is a great time to put up your rents. Like, they're rent gouging, right? So we fight for a rent freeze, and we've been part of, we have a relationship with Sadiq Khan, and we played a really important role in making him call for a rent freeze. We campaigned on Foxton's, and we built we did 6 actions across the city, and we built the profile of a rent freeze, and we work closely with our comrades in Scotland who won a rent freeze, and we think about how we can strategically do that. Temporary accommodation, which is one of the things that Kwajo also mentioned, we campaign on that in Newham, in our different branches. We fight against, we struggle against local authorities for them to cut contracts with these big temporary accommodation providers, because there is tens of millions of pounds being spent on temporary accommodation, and it's a big rigged system where these companies are making loads of money off of local authorities, and when we're not putting money back into social housing. There's lots of campaigning we do. The renters reform bill, which is coming through Parliament. We're part of a coalition to kind of push it more to the left, and no fault evictions, which Kwajo also mentioned, like Section 21. We campaigned and got that ended, and then they didn't actually enforce it, and then we had to campaign more to get it ended, and then they put it in some legislation, but now the legislation is stalling. So, it's kind of an on and off battle. But I'll just quickly pivot to talking about making home, because I feel like that's important if we're talking about housing struggle. And I just want to start with, like, you can't really talk about the question of making home without kind of reckoning with what home means within a capitalist society. Like, home has been, can I say bastardized? Is that, yeah? Yeah. It's been bastardized. It's hard to even know what a home really is. Like, home in capitalism is, first and foremost a commodity. It's commodified. And when something is commodified, it's about value. And when it's about value, it's not about human value, it's about profit. So the fundamental idea of home is disappeared within the capitalist system. There is no home, there is housing, there is assets. And it's allowed to get to the point where, like I said, people are selling homes for £100 million. There was actually one flat that sold for 100 million on its own. So, like, there is that. There's also, like, homes are sites of social reproduction. Homes within the capitalist system are where not just, like, I'm saying value themselves, but all value within society starts within the home, because within the home is where families are raised, it's where values are taught, and it's where, like, the ability for people to go out into the world and make profit starts. So, like, homes are also social, and that's extremely gendered and racialized, that type of work that happens within the home. So, and homes are sites of interlocking crises, like we said, right? Like the climate crisis. David Harvey, who's a great economist, wrote an article quite a few years ago called, like, The Right to the City, which is a really important concept to kind of think with and sit with and study. And in it, he writes about how cities produce 70% of carbon emissions. The production and reproduction of cities, the materials, the types of buildings, the roads, the homes, the business, that produces climate crisis. And how we build our homes, right, and how we build our communities is part of the solution for dealing with the climate crisis. And yeah, I just briefly on, like, health crisis, like, it seems so self-evident, but I guess it's worth saying that, like, the housing crisis is a health crisis. So many of our members are disabled by their housing. So many of our leaders have had ceilings fall in on them, and then they're permanently disabled by their housing. Or like one of our members recently had to send their child back to Somalia because their child is so ill and they can't access healthcare, and they're so worried that this kid is going to die. Do you know how many people are worried because of Awa Bishak? Like, how many people are frightened for their child's safety? So they revert to doing things like sending their children back home. And this member is so depressed. Can you imagine being severed from your child, or the child being severed from their parent? So many of our members live with respiratory issues. And the thing about Awa Bishak that's really important is that one of the people who work with fungus, mycologists, there was like a mycologist who did a really important thing, which was establishing causality, right, between poor housing, damp, mold, and death. And right, we're trying to do this in one of the estates that we're working on. We're trying to work with people to establish the link between poor housing and poor mental health. There is nothing out there. It's very hard to argue it, but it's so obviously true, right? But if you try and do something about it, there's no evidence there. So something that we're always thinking about how health relates to housing. And we're working on retrofitting that same estate where we're thinking about how it relates to housing. And I guess just like, what could home be, right? Like, I think there's one example of, there's this municipality, this housing project in Vienna. It was called Red Vienna. It was like it's not even like a kind of like housing justice vision. What could housing be? It was a social democratic project that was set up after the war. But what they had there was housing where people had dentists and cinemas and like spas, and it was connected, and it was community, and there was a sense of like place, right? Because place is what's being destroyed. Like, what's happening in this city where I'm born and where I grew up is that I'm just watching place disappear, home disappear. Like, the developers come and bought the whole street that I grew up on. And when I go back, I'm like, I mean, I was in zone 5. I was like, it's never going to come here. It's never going to come to Hounslow. It will never be gentrified in Hounslow. But, the Crossrail came. And, like, there's a word for that. It's called domicide. It's the purposeful destruction of home, place, and community. And that's what's happening in Palestine. And that's why, in many ways, housing justice is related to anti-colonial struggle as well. And we have to think about how this happens in all parts of the world. Like in South Africa with Abaklali, Bas, and Jondolo, like, who do amazing work around housing struggle and the shack dwellers movement. It's all connected. But now I'm absolutely rambling, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I think we can all agree with all our speakers. I can't keep up taking notes, I'll be honest. So I'm just really deeply appreciative of everyone sharing their thoughts and their experiences, your work, Joshua. I think there's a couple of things that I'm just gonna put on the table before we take our break. I think this element of privatization, we're seeing with the deregulation, where everything's reduced to a value. I think it's very powerful how you speak to how the idea of a home is deconstructed. And we even see it with, like, within sort of the neoliberal system that we're in, it's about giving the appearance of livability, right? We see with new builds, it doesn't even make any sense. Like, why are the pipes going this way or whatever, and what's behind the wall? It could be nothing, right? Everything can be empty, because everything is about the appearance of livability, but it's actually not a home. Everything has been so reduced to values. And I think your experience really highlighted that. Yeah, I think I have a lot of other thoughts. Maybe what I'll do is, how about we'll just gather our thoughts. Let's take 10 minutes right now, just to gather our thoughts, gather your reflections. So we're gonna go ahead and open the space again. I'm gonna launch us with a question, one that's been bothering me for a long time. And then what we're going to do is we're gonna open it up for the audience and for everyone to sort of engage in this conversation. This is not structured, so the panelists also feel free to speak to each other, and we're gonna engage in this conversation together, yeah? So I think maybe just to start us off, the question I think that's always been bugging me, and I think it kind of follows off from what Joshua was saying about, needing to prove the lack of dignity that many people experience for so long. And, you know, you were talking about mental health, and the problem is that we can't really qualify over 20 years, decades of living in insecure, unsafe housing. So it comes down to this idea of proof often when we deal especially with the public and with corridors of power, right? We have to speak to politicians and somehow demonstrate that this violence is real. There's already a tension there of having to sort of reduce things in ways that are palpable, but in doing so, we're often quite dismissive of how violent that sense of insecurity can really be. So there's that on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's also this element of these politicians being frankly really terrible and the political climate being really bad. So also pandering to them, I feel like also almost kind of validates what they've been doing and saying. You know, we spoke about the bill, for example. So can you talk to all of us a little bit about, yeah, mobilizing around these tensions? I don't know.
Thank you, Tariq. The question is very complex, but we'll find a way to come up with an answer. I don't know what my colleagues think, but I believe that the system have made the hostile environment by design. So the hostile environment is not just about, when we're talking about housing here, it's everything. Education, healthcare, people close to public fund. When I did speak about asylum seekers, for example, when you are seeking for protection, you have no right to work. And people might be struggling to wait for their status, maybe 5 years or more. They have no saving. They have nothing. And when Home Office finally give you a status, they give you, I believe now they reduce it, 7 days to leave those accommodation you were living. And then ask question yourself, where will you go? So this go back to, let's say, for example, me that is a member of Migrant Organized, I will go back to Migrant Organized, which is a charity. And if Migrant Organized is not in place, this is where we're going back now to healthcare problem. That will cause people mental health, and a lot of sort of things. So I think for what the system do to us, they have power to create policies. But I think we have power with our voice. And I believe that for my personal experience, there's nothing more important than people dignity, respect, freedom, and justice. So as community, when we are come together, we can end anything. Anything is possible. Thank you.
I think of that question, and you said it as well, Nanu, that it's designed by the system, and so I think that's the really important part of the conversation, that it's not a failure of the system, it's not a broken system. The system is designed to operate in that way. It's designed to manufacture this idea of scarcity, and that therefore we're all competing for scarce resources. And so, like, I should have done what Josh did. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Runnymede Trust. It's not a Runnymede Trust position, but I guess that what we do often is we operate in that policy space. We have to be doing the research to find the data. You know, we're having conversations about data visualization. How can we make this data a way appealing, or kind of translate what is really kind of actually fundamentally deeply distressing information in a way that kind of people can understand and move with. So we're often doing that, trying to prove, you know, this is important, this is an issue. we're often doing what you probably described. I don't think my colleagues would like, we don't pander, but we're having to have those conversations in places that actually we would probably rather not be sometimes, because we know actually the ears that are hearing our words are not ones that are friendly or warm to our interests. So I think it's a long game. And it doesn't fix the situation now, and it's really all very nice for me to be able to say it because I have a nice house and me and my children don't have to worry about stuff in the here and now. But it is the long game. It's the long game because it's not about proof and pandering, I think it's about us as communities coming together and recognizing that actually it's not for them to give, it's for us to take and for us to make. And I think that's where we need to kind of put our energy. It is the long game. It doesn't fix it for the here and now. It doesn't translate to the Awab Ishaks and the parents who have children in homes where we're trying to prove a case that the microbiologist is coming in. It doesn't help them here and now, but I think that we need to play the long game. We need to be visionary about what changes we need to see, and it's not going to come from as much as, who was it that you were speaking to? Sadiq Khan and the Michael Goves of the world. They're not going to give it to us.
It's a really tricky question. I think I just want to say, acknowledge that it is extremely dehumanizing to have the burden of proof put onto you when you're going through something that's so self-evident to you. And I think what's really, it's connected. I feel like what's really challenging for a lot of people about this moment with the war in the war on Gaza is this incessant having to prove something that's so self-evident to you, that it is a genocide.
Fearful, right?
Yeah.
Fearful
Even speak about it. Yeah.
To even speak about
Yeah.
it. We are fearful to
Exactly.
speak about it.
Yeah, it's an incredibly immoral and dehumanizing situation. On the moral, I think it's important to establish that it isn't. This isn't about morals. We can't pander and plead and persuade these people on a moral basis. So when I spoke about creating proof, just to contextualize that, we're creating proof for a legal case. We're going to take a legal case, and that's to be able to. I'm not pandering to your morality. No. I mean, I'm not pandering to your morality, the morality of the housing association. I'm trying to prove in the court of law that there's an established causality here. You can't, worm your way out of this. I think what we talk about a lot in the union and we train around is this idea of self-interest. You have to make it in the self-interest of the power holder to change what they're doing. We have to disrupt the city and business as usual and the ability of politicians to meet, Kamala Harris and that donut, who's I can't remember his name. Who's our Prime Minister? Rishi Sunak. There's been so many. But we have to make it untenable that they can continue to do what they do, and it's in their self-interest to consider a ceasefire. We have to make it untenable when that housing association that we're taking to court, we have to make it, we got the MP to speak about them in the Houses of Parliament. We got the regulator for social housing to downgrade them. We got Sadiq Khan to cut their funding. We got Channel 4 to shame them. And then they're it's definitely in our self-interest to listen now. Yeah, we're going to put a new estate manager on the estate. We're going to change the bollards. We're going to change the doors. We're going to put some scaffolding up, pretty it. But you have to fight on the basis of interest. You have to be scientific about it. It's not about proof and morality, except where it's strategic for a legal case. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
God, it is a very, very difficult and complex question. I think one thing I've learned over the last few years in regards to my work is that often business and politics doesn't deal with what's morally right or morally wrong. What they deal with is what's financially benefit, or what keeps the world going, and that's money. And It is a real shame, and what I've had to do is try and tailor my work from what is morally correct as human beings, what us as human beings and individuals should see as right compared to wrong. When it comes to decision making, I've had to sort of put a financial cost on it to prove that it is wrong. Let's say, especially when it comes to living in poor conditions. We talk about the relationship between health and housing. I mean, last year it was £1.4 billion spent by the NHS looking after those living in poor conditions. It was £34 million spent by the NHS on those living in homes filled with damp and mould and had adverse health conditions as a result. And in regards to education too, the money that's lost as a result of kids not fulfilling their potential when it comes to education because they're living in poor conditions or being moved every 28 days from hotel room to hotel room and can't, as a result, study or get the quality of education that they need in order to progress. And it's a sort of cycle, and often these kids are from disadvantaged backgrounds as it is. So I'm convinced in the fact that, yes, there may be politicians lower down the ranks and MPs lower down the ranks that do put their morals before decision making, but the further up you go within politics and political parties, it's more about what's going to win you the election rather than what's morally right. And that's something that we've learned, and I think something that's we've learned over the last few weeks and days, especially understanding what is currently happening in Gaza and the amount of displacement that we're seeing, the people, the innocent individuals killed. As human beings, often we would say that innocent civilians shouldn't die, and innocent civilians should be allowed to live in their homes, and more needs to be done in order to defend them from those sitting in comfortable seats. But what we're seeing politically, not just here in the UK, but across the board, is actually, in fact, we're not prioritising that, and in fact, we're prioritising what is seen as politically right, or going to sort of keep you going and keep you in the roles and jobs that you want in the future. And I think that's absolutely the wrong way to go. But it's not just in regards to what's happening in Gaza at the moment, but what's been happening in housing across the last few decades. It's been less about what's wrong. We've all known for the last 30 years that we're depleting the amount of social housing stock that we have. Why? Because we're selling them off for a profit. What we're seeing in this country is we're prioritising profit over what is a necessity, and that is wrong. If we was doing the same with food or water, there would absolutely be outrage because of the amount of people that would die as a result of that wouldn't have access to that. But because it's housing, there's a financial figure placed on that, and it's seen as more of an asset or a way to accumulate assets than it is the necessity and importance to have a roof, and a safe and decent roof over your head. And that is what is wrong, I think, with humanity, because as human beings, we're built to deal with morals. I can only imagine hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago, and when it came to decision making, we would base that on morals rather than what was beneficial for us as individuals. But that has changed as humanity and time has passed on, and we've come to this sort of rotten place where that is our priority. And when that is our priority, there's a huge group of people that is neglected and slipped through the net as a result of that, and they are the casualties of that in whatever situation you want to place it in, whether it's housing, whether it's Gaza, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education. And that is where we need to change. That is where politics and politicians need to change their stance. They have to remember why it is that you went into politics. If you've gone into politics because of financial gains and assets and tried to push that rather than what's morally right for the people of this country, ultimately you shouldn't be in politics. I think that is a point we need to make. We need to prioritize humanity and individuals and lives and human beings over anything else within society, because if we don't, we see situations like we're seeing now with people suffering within housing. We've had 40 years where people have suffered in housing, where people are choosing to feed their kids or pay their rent, or in healthcare where we can't even go to dentists or see our GPs, or education where kids are really, really struggling. People can't afford to go to university no more. That is what we need to prioritize, and I think fundamentally it comes down to care. And if we don't care about these subjects, there's no point talking about it, because it's never going to get sorted. And what we've seen for the last 40 years with housing is not being sorted because the right people, or the people that are affected most, aren't in a position not just to care, but to influence too. And that's what we need to change as a people and as society, as well as continuing these conversations. It's not just, again, housing, but what we're seeing in regards to war. And we talk about war and the fact that where there's war, there's opportunity to make money. And there is opportunity to make money for some countries as opposed to others. But for those not making money, they're losing lives, ultimately. And it's about that priority, and I think that's a clear distinction. What's more important, lives or finances, and generating income, generating assets, exploiting a situation where people are suffering? And that is where we get it wrong time and time again within society, is we see situations where people are being exploited because of their suffering, whether it be migrants, like I spoke to you about, and refugees, and the fact that they're so desperate that we have opportunities for the likes of Serco to exploit their suffering. And it's about calling that out and not allowing the exploitation of people's suffering and desperation to continue, because where there is suffering, no matter where it is in society or wherever it is in the world or history, there's always opportunity for exploitation. We see time and time again that is always something that happens by those that are often well off or in a position or situation to be able to do that. And that is what we need to be calling out. That is what we need to change. We are human beings at the end of the day. We know the difference between right or wrong. But for many, money is more important than what is right. And that is the conversations we need to be having, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to mention that you're sitting with a very experienced panel, that when you pose them a tricky question, they'll say that it was a tricky question, but give very insightful and eloquent responses. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. We'd like to open it up now to the audience. If you have any thoughts, questions that you'd like to ask, and I'll just mention that it can be either to specific members of the panel, it can be to everyone. Yes. Oh, yeah. The microphone will be handed around. Please speak into the microphone.
So, is this on? I've actually just finished not long reading a book called Radical Intimacy, which talks a lot about care and community. And I think that what you've just said about us all needing to care and having care, but at this point I'm at a point of such deep exhaustion of fighting just to be alive, to survive. How do we mobilize that when I think so many of us are just so fucking exhausted?
I think it's very, very difficult. And I thought about this earlier, actually. And I think as human beings, what makes us continue and keep going is the idea of hope. And if we didn't have that, then a lot of us, we wouldn't be sat here doing what we do now. It's because we have hope. And we know there is an opportunity there for change, but it's about convincing others that it needs to happen. It's very difficult, though, when we live in a society, in a world. For example, I studied economics, and I remember being shocked at the fact that my economics, he might be wrong, I was crap at economics, but he said, when we were speaking about employment or unemployment, he mentioned, we can never have 0% unemployment. We need unemployment. Yes, we can reduce unemployment, but we always need it for this idea of competitiveness. And that's for me where I thought, well, if this is economics teaching us that, then things are wrong within society, because we're almost fighting our own sort of intuition as human beings and what is morally right and morally wrong. We should expect that, everyone should be able to live comfortably and be able to work, but if it doesn't fit the sort of situation, economic situation that we're living in, it's not going to be the consensus, and it's going to be hard to fight against that. But as human beings, what we know is that hope and collectiveness is way stronger than that. If through my situation, if I thought, there's no point being hopeful, let me just get my situation sorted with and just sort of move on and live my my happy life. And again, it comes down to selfishness too. If I decided to do that, then my situation would be sorted, but there would be millions of people up and down the country that wouldn't have that, or wouldn't have had that same opportunity to have their stories heard, and I wouldn't be filled with a hope to continue, not because I'm paid or anything, but because I simply care and I know there's opportunity to change. And yes, I'm not in a place of power in regards to influence, direct power in Westminster, but I know if I can convince the next person and explain to the next person that this is what's happening, this is how people are living, I might be able to change mindset, and that's how you create change, and that's how you create hope too. So it's very, very deflating. You're telling the right persons, because I feel it on a daily basis, but again, like I mentioned, everyone in this panel will feel that sense of hope, and even in times like now, what we're seeing in the news and the amount of devastation caused, and just how horrific it is, still even through that, we have to have hope as human beings. Otherwise, if we don't have that, what do we have?
Yeah, it is difficult to say that you cannot be tired. I'm personally talking from experience. They toss you up and down. They tell you, you're not going to have it. They will deport you tomorrow or after tomorrow. But what I can say, we should continue to hope, as he said. And I am always saying and continue to say, because this is the experience I have from my community. When we come together as a community like this, we organize together. This is how we can make change. They can intimidate us that we're never going to win, but I believe that one day we shall overcome. That is by speaking with your community, speaking with people that you might be living in your road, but you don't know people that are going through more than what you have. And I believe that us as a community, that's how we can make change. There's no other miracle. It's us, continue to speak, continue to raise your voice and awareness. People power is unlimited. And those people is us, nobody else. And we continue to hope, and one day we should win. I believe in that. Thank you.
Yeah, do you know what? That sense of tiredness, that sense of fatigue is so real, right? Like when everything feels so grim and bleak, it's really tempting to and not just tempting, our bodies sometimes do, they have to sit in that place, right? And I feel like I don't think we should deny ourselves the opportunity to rest as well. I think that's part of what this whole kind of conversation's about, is that actually sometimes you can't keep going as much as we want to. You have to stop, you have to take a break, and you have to pause. And I think that's really important for us to enable each other to do that, and to make sure that actually when we recognize that someone else within our kind of community is struggling, that we find the resources to be able to enable them to rest, because wearing us out and eroding us to the is part of the strategy that kind of limits our potential. And Kwajo, I think that you, in particular, you know, I'm so much older than you, and I feel like a maternal instinct towards you, because I feel like we should never carry the kind of burdens that you've carried individually. They are ours as a collective, as a community, and what you have done, like single-handedly, I imagine there is such a hardship and such a cost to you to have done that. And I'm grateful to you, and I think that all of us are grateful to you for that. But I think it is a responsibility for us to kind of step up and know that this is not an individual fight. And the gains are for all of us to share, including those people at the top, because actually at the end of the day, you know, it's that whole kind of, you know, no one benefits. Dehumanizing anyone, you know, or othering other people, you lose yourself in that process too. And I know that sounds kind of really romantic, but I genuinely do believe it. And the other thing is that the Bengali squatters movement, if I go back to that, when I think about what they did in the 1970s, it must have seemed impossible. They didn't speak the language, they didn't have any money, they didn't have a home, they didn't have any resources, they didn't have any political capital. And it must have seemed impossible to win the kind of things that they did. And so for me, I always feel like, again, you know, reaching back to our past, thinking about some of the things that seemed impossible when we were fighting for them, we won them. But we need to take care of each other in that process as well, and give each other a break. And if you're tired, stop. And that's what I would say.
It's a really, really good question, and thank you for asking it. There's at the top of that banner in the middle, it says resistance to work, and I feel like that's really an important place to start from. Like, rest is important. Rest is radical. Rest is like a deeply radical act, right? Like in a system where it's like the productivity mindset is just everything. Like, I have to remind myself that lying down and taking a beat is a really radical thing to do. And like, I'm a bit of a like, keep going. But that's really important. And I guess like, we should be saying to one another like, rest, mate, like, you know, find some time. But I think we actually need to go a step further and think about how we create networks and systems that make that possible. Like, we're living in late austerity. Like, people are just shattered and destroyed, and like, there's no disposable income. People have to work many jobs, as you've spoken about. Like, it's very hard. It's almost a bit offensive to say, take some time to rest. So, you know, like, there's a really great book called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, and I believe the author is like Leah Lakshmi, and I think there's a third name, but that's the one that I remember. And I guess for like, you know, taking inspiration from this space that we're in, like for disability justice activists, like this isn't like a nicety on the edge of what we do, it's the core of what we do. We have to find ways to collectivize the responsibility to care for one another. So like, they speak a lot about the experiences of care collectives and creating mutual aid networks that think about how we can visibilize and distribute the work that it takes to care for one another, right? The work, and talk about it as work. And I think like, you know, in my workplace the other day, I was like, look, the union's like really great and stuff, but it tells me in the way we work in this union that I need to be productive and I need to keep going, and we're burning each other out. So if we're like expanding our office and stuff, and I was like, if we're gonna expand the office, I want a room where I can go in and like switch a button and like little twinkly lights come on and some soothing music comes on, and I can lie down in a like bean bag, and actually I want this workplace to tell me that rest is important. And not every workplace can do that. Obviously I work for like a tenants union, so I'm quite fortunate, but it is something to lobby for. You know, like, it's a welfare thing in a workplace. It is a workplace issue, that productivity. You know, you can pitch it another way if you want. Like, if you do this, I'm probably going to be more productive. But, you know, in a Google style thing. But I think it is, one, a workplace issue and a community issue, and we have to think about how we can build those kind of care collectives and mutual aid networks around us and share that responsibility.
Thank you. Any more questions, thoughts?
I was wondering if during the years that you've studied or worked or fought against this issue, if you saw a positive change, or if, on the contrary, the issue has stagnated, or if it got worse. Hopefully it didn't, but yeah.
Thank you for the question. I have one example in our organizing group. We had one member of migrant organized that was living in Tower Hamlet. They were sharing this temporary home given by the Home Office, managed by Clear Spring. There was a day we visited our member, but we found in the house there was not just him, it was like 6 men in the house, but they were no member of migrant organized. So when they saw us, they were like, oh, you from Migrant Help. How are you gonna help us? Because Migrant Help is another organization that working on behalf of the Home Office. So we put our collective idea together, and we said it should start by themselves, people that living that kind of experience in that house. The house was, when you're coming by the door, there was a kind of smelling that human beings shouldn't live in that kind of house. The carpet was wet. The shower room, there was no hot water. Water wasn't even coming. The kitchen was without no fridge, and 5 or 6 men living in the house. They sleep on the floor. Everything was broken. The door by the main door downstairs was broken. But when you come out from the building outside looked very posh. But inside, it was a place no human being should live. What I want to say is that we put our collective idea together, including them. They approached the the community around. There was a local newspaper that published an article about the place. We made some phone call, like people was calling anonymous from our office. We were calling migrant help, because when people call them, apparently they don't pick their phone. But we were calling them to say that, look, there's a problem, you should fix it. Because the managers, they don't even go. But by coming together, organizing together, making noise, that house today that I'm talking is being fixed. People can actually sleep on the bed. People can use the kitchen. They can live again like human being. That's kind of part of it's not all solution to everybody, but this means that if we come together and we speak up and we ask for what we want, there can be some change. And on top of that, the person that we went there for to look at the place, I remember, few months later, he got his status. But then guess what? He was evicted. Because when they give you your status, they give you a few days to leave, to move out. And that is kind of the problem being solved, but it's still continuous, which means that we have to continue to do what we do, because otherwise we go back to the same problem. There can be solution. It's not the final solution, but I believe that when we do something together, when we speak together, there's always a solution, even though a big one, but a small one that make a difference. Thank you. I hope I answer your question.
Do other panelists want to speak to this question?
Yeah, I would just quickly say, in terms of the wins for me personally, it's being able to take an individual or a family out of a situation that me and my family were in, whether that being a young child that's grown up and all they've known is damp and mold, or someone living in a home for 27 years that's been ignored, and then you put on social media and within 24 hours they're moved out. That for me are important wins, because it proves that they can do what it is that they're supposed to do. I mean, there is room for that. It's not impossible. And it also does, it not just shows me that it's possible, but also others and tenants, and it's empowering for them. In terms of more than that, yes, government have been speaking about the issue in regards to housing, and I have no doubt I'm going to continue to push to make sure that housing is top of the agenda at the next general election, in particular poor housing, and making sure that no longer continues, and the need and access to decent and safe homes for all. And yes, there is a lot more acknowledgement of that and the need for that. But does that mean there's been positive change, or does that mean people are becoming more acclimatized to the issues that we are highlighting now and just going to sit there once they are acclimatized, thinking that is the new standard and what we should expect, but do nothing to improve on that and change that? And that for me is what we all have to wait and see whether that happens or whether change actually comes. But I mean, first and foremost comes acknowledgement and the need to care, and so far that is starting to change. But we've still got a long way to go. When we talk about rhetoric of refugees and people coming here to the UK and the way in which they're demonized, that just sets us back even further than where we are currently or where we've been before, and as well as other issues like Gaza at the moment, and we keep getting pushed back as a society, I think, in our views and what we should expect from the people and those in charge. But we have to take those small wins, I think, and they are happening, but is enough being done? I mean, we have to wait, and is genuine change going to come? We have to wait and see for that. But again, it comes back to hope.
Sorry, before any of the other panelists want to speak, do any of you want to answer this question as well? Or both of you?
Just a really brief.
Okay.
Just a really brief thing, like seeing lots of wins and seeing lots of failures. And I guess like something that I hold in my mind, I guess especially right now with what's happening in Palestine, there's an important political figure of the past called Lenin. And he said, like, he once said this thing, like, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And like a situation like what's happening in Gaza right now, it's a situation where you kind of feel like in a few weeks, decades have happened. And that's what people are saying, like, it will never return to what it was like before. But if you take a step back, like, yeah, that's true what happened on the surface, but like, the resistance fighters there were preparing for a very long time, building tunnels, reverse engineering arms, like preparing themselves for a moment. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect on, is like, there's a great organization in Philadelphia called Philly Youth for Change. It's like a youth-led organization. And they said, they were doing an interview, and people were like, how come you're so prepared for like when the George Floyd riots happened? And they said, oh, we put out rain collectors. You know, like every time there's a crisis or something happening, we're collecting resources and power and building our movement so that the next time we're ready. And this thing about being ready is really important, like what I'm saying about them freedom fighters. For our organization, like, crisis knocks at the door in a way that's very spontaneous sometimes. Like, something can happen, a police officer can kill someone, Abishak could die, and you've got a political moment. You need to be ready for it, and that's not linear. So, like, you need to build up your capacity. It could be within yourself as an activist, like building up your capacity, or within your organization, building up your capacity, knowing that at some point you're going to be needed, or you're powerful enough to create a moment, like what's happened in Palestine. So yeah, it's not really, it feels like it's not really linear, and a lot of it is about like preparing oneself for a crisis, or to be able to create a crisis, if that makes sense.
I'm mindful I saw one more hand in the back, two more hands. Unfortunately, we actually, to be respectful of the space that we're in, and that's part of sort of the part of rehearsal, is being able to rehearse the boundary making, right? So we really don't have much more than the time for one comment, right? So maybe one of the people who had their hands up, they can maybe share any thoughts or reflections. If it's a question, then maybe it's something you can perhaps pose then directly to the speakers after, but we do have to come to a close right now. So you have the final word if you have any thoughts.
It's quite a lot of pressure to have the final word, but I'll just put it out, and maybe in conversations after, in the mix, in the group, we can chat. It's about this idea that a lot of abolitionist thinkers put forward about non-reformist reform, and you talked a lot about having a really strong vision and taking and making, not just like being on their terms. But at the same time, we have to also hold that these small wins are really important and crucial and critical. So I guess my question to the room is like, how do we keep pushing for acknowledging that we need these small wins, we need to be lobbying around the renters reform bills, but how do we also hold that vision for a more radical future, and how do we rehearse that now? I guess is my closing question for the room.
I mean, if I may say, I think that's a beautiful question to end on as well. I think, in fact, we don't have all the answers, and I think that's what the speakers are alluding to. And I think that's actually a really fantastic question that speaks to the openness of the future, and it gives us hope. I think that was also one of the previous comments, and I think it ties it all very well together, so I appreciate that very much. We spoke about so many different themes. I wouldn't have all the time to summarize it. I just want to, first of all, thank the speakers so much for coming. If we can give them, please, a round of applause. So part of rehearsing freedoms is really being able to hold on to the openness of these questions. And this is something that we're very much looking to do and work upon at Healing Justice London in particular. So two things to that. First of all, keep your eye out on the, I don't have the list of events in front of me. I should have probably earmarked a few of them, but many of events revolve around healing justice, housing justice, etc. So keep your eye out for other events that we're having. And for this space in particular, I mean, one thing that we are rehearsing is finding these spaces, and I think many of the speakers alluded to the need of having spaces to be seen, to be heard, and I'm hoping for many of you, you feel seen and validated as much as I felt being with the speakers here today. So certainly keep an eye out for what Healing Justice London is going to provide in the future as well. On that note, it's exactly 9 o'clock, so out of respect, again, for everyone here, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So we're going to clear up the space. Thank you so much. If you'd like to take a moment to speak with speakers, please, you feel free to do so. But we will have to be leaving within, I would say, about 10, 15 minutes. We'd hope everyone would leave. Thank you so much. Have a good day.